The Colorado morning was brisk, with a mist so thick it veiled the evergreens that bordered Sarah Dawson's property. She pulled her cardigan tighter around herself as she stepped onto the front porch, clutching a steaming mug of coffee. The world was silent, save for the faint rustle of leaves in the distance, a rare peace Sarah had learned to embrace in her solitude. It had been 5 years since her husband, James Dawson, vanished during a research expedition in the Rockies. 5 years of unanswered questions, unyielding grief, and mornings like this one, where she still instinctively brewed 2 cups of coffee before remembering there was no one to share it with. Sarah was about to retreat inside when she noticed movement at the edge of her yard. A figure emerged from the fog. A dog. The animal was large, a German Shepherd mix with a coat that seemed to absorb the muted light of the morning. Its amber eyes locked onto hers, intelligent and unwavering, as if it carried a message only she could understand. But what truly seized Sarah's attention was the object clutched in its jaws. A weathered blue Gore-Tex jacket, frayed at the edges and stained with dirt. Her heart stopped. She knew that jacket. The coffee mug slipped from her grasp, shattering on the wooden porch. She barely noticed. Trembling, she stepped forward, the old boards creaking beneath her weight. "Hey there," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Where? Where did you get that?" The dog didn't run. It stood its ground, dropping the jacket at her feet before sitting back on its haunches. Its gaze never left hers. Sarah knelt down, her hands shaking as she reached for the jacket. The fabric was damp and carried the faint, musty scent of earth and decay, but there was no mistaking it. It was James's jacket, the one he had been wearing the day he disappeared. As her fingers brushed the material, memories surged like a tidal wave. James pulling the jacket on that morning, flashing her his familiar lopsided grin before heading out the door. The search parties combing the mountains for days. The tearful meetings with authorities as hope faded. The empty memorial service she had reluctantly agreed to hold. The dog let out a soft whine, breaking her reverie. "What is this?" Sarah murmured. She patted the jacket's pockets instinctively, finding nothing at first. But as she shook it, a small folded piece of paper fluttered to the ground. She snatched it up, her breath catching as she unfolded it. The handwriting was unmistakably James's, though the ink was faded and water-streaked. "Follow the trail. 39.7392 degrees N, 104.9903 degrees Ws. Trust the dog." Tears blurred her vision as she reread the note. 5 years of pain, of questions without answers, and now this. A cryptic message and a dog that had materialized out of nowhere. The dog whined again and nudged her hand with its nose. "Where did you come from?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She reached out to touch the dog's collar, but the tags were missing, leaving only a strip of worn leather. Something about the animal felt eerily familiar, though she couldn't place why. Sarah's thoughts spun wildly. She needed help. This wasn't something she could unravel alone. She pushed herself to her feet, the jacket clutched tightly in one hand, and went back inside to retrieve her phone. The number she dialed was one she hadn't used in years. It rang 4 times before a gruff voice answered. "Sarah?" "Ethan," she said, her voice trembling. "I need your help. It's about James." The line went quiet for a moment. Then, "I'll be there in an hour." Sarah paced the living room, the blue jacket draped over the back of a chair. Her gaze flicked repeatedly toward the dog, which sat patiently by the door, its amber eyes following her every move. It wasn't restless, nor did it seem lost. The dog was calm, deliberate, as if it knew exactly why it was here. She kept glancing at the note, now lying on the coffee table beside her phone. The coordinates, 39.7392 degrees N, 104.993 degrees W, were etched into her mind. It was a place she vaguely recognized, deep in the Rockies, not far from where James's car had been found abandoned 5 years ago. Before she could think too much about it, the rumble of an engine reached her ears. Moments later, a familiar pickup truck pulled into the driveway. Ethan Blake stepped out, his tall frame as rugged and dependable as she remembered. His salt and pepper hair was shorter now, his once keen eyes softened by age, but he still carried himself with the steady authority of a seasoned detective. Ethan had been the lead investigator on James's case, and although he'd retired 2 years ago, he'd left Sarah with his personal number, saying, "Call me if you ever find something." Sarah opened the door before he could knock. "Ethan," she said, her voice tight with emotion. He gave her a nod, his expression a mixture of curiosity and concern. You sounded shaken on the phone. What's going on? Wordlessly, she handed him the jacket. Ethan's brow furrowed as he examined it, his fingers brushing over the frayed fabric. This is James's, isn't it? He asked softly. Sarah nodded, then picked up the note and held it out to him. Ethan read it twice, his face growing more serious with each pass. Coordinates? He muttered. And the dog? He glanced toward the shepherd, which sat quietly by the doorway, still watching. It brought the jacket to me, Sarah said. I don't know where it came from, but... She hesitated. Ethan, I think it's trying to tell me something. Ethan folded the note carefully and placed it on the table. You realize what you're saying sounds unusual. I know how it sounds, Sarah said, her voice rising. But this jacket, this note, it's real, Ethan, and James wrote it. Ethan regarded her for a long moment, then sighed. Let's say this dog is leading you somewhere. Are you ready to follow? You know how dangerous that area is, Sarah. That's why the search was called off after a week. The terrain, the weather, it's unpredictable, especially this time of year. I don't care, she said firmly. If there's even the slightest chance that James is alive, I have to go. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck, clearly weighing his options. All right, he said finally. I'll come with you, but we need to be prepared. Sarah nodded, relief flooding through her. I'll pack what we need. The truck bounced along the narrow dirt road that snaked toward the foothills of the Rockies. Ethan gripped the steering wheel with practiced ease, while Sarah sat beside him, the dog curled up in the back seat. The jacket and note were tucked securely in her backpack, along with supplies she had hastily gathered, flashlights, water, a first aid kit, and James's old GPS unit. You still haven't told me where you think this dog came from, Ethan said, breaking the silence. I don't know, Sarah admitted, but I feel like I've seen it before. During the search for James, there were reports of a stray shepherd near the area where his car was found. Some of the rescue team thought it might be a trained dog that got separated from its owner. You think this could be the same dog? Ethan asked, glancing at her. It's possible, Sarah said. But even if it's not, it knows something. It brought me James's jacket. That can't be a coincidence. Ethan hummed thoughtfully, but said nothing more. They parked at a secluded trailhead, the air crisp and the sky tinged with the soft hues of late afternoon. The area was eerily quiet, save for the distant sound of wind rustling through the pines. The dog leapt out of the truck and immediately began moving toward the forest, its tail held high like a guide flag. Well, Ethan said, grabbing his gear. It looks like we're following the dog. Sarah adjusted her backpack and tightened her hiking boots, her heart pounding with a mix of anticipation and fear. The trail was overgrown and barely visible, winding through dense clusters of evergreens and patches of rocky terrain. The dog moved with purpose, occasionally glancing back to ensure they were following. You know, Ethan said after a while, his voice low, it's hard not to feel like we're being watched out here. Sarah stiffened, her eyes darting to the shadows between the trees. Watched by who? Could be nothing, Ethan said quickly. Just a gut feeling. But stay alert. As the sun dipped lower, they emerged into a clearing that took Sarah's breath away. Towering rock formations surrounded them, their jagged edges glowing softly in the fading light. At the far end of the clearing, partially obscured by vegetation, was an entrance to what looked like an old mining tunnel. This isn't marked on any map, Ethan said, frowning as he examined the entrance. The dog stopped at the tunnel's mouth, turning to look at Sarah and Ethan as if waiting for them to catch up. It's here, Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper. This is where the coordinates led. Ethan scanned the area with a practiced eye, then crouched to examine the ground. There's fresh boot prints here, he said grimly. Someone's been through recently. Sarah's pulse quickened. Do you think it could be James? Could be, Ethan said, standing. But if it's not, we might be walking into something dangerous. The dog barked sharply, the sound echoing off the rock walls. It padded into the tunnel, pausing to look back at them. We're not going to stop here, Sarah said, her determination hardening. Ethan sighed but nodded. All right, let's see where this leads. As they stepped into the tunnel, the dog leading the way, the forest behind them seemed to hold its breath. The cool air of the tunnel wrapped around Sarah as they stepped inside, the sound of their boots crunching against loose gravel echoing faintly in the darkness. Ethan flicked on a high-powered flashlight, its beam cutting through the gloom to reveal rough-hewn walls and rusted remnants of old mining equipment. The dog padded ahead, its movements cautious but deliberate, its tail wagging low as if urging them forward. "This mine must be over a century old," Ethan muttered, his light passing over wooden support beams darkened with age. "It's a miracle these tunnels are still standing." Sarah's grip on her flashlight tightened. "Do you think James came through here?" Ethan hesitated. "Hard to say. If he did, he wasn't alone. Those fresh boot prints outside weren't his size. And—" He trailed off, his gaze scanning the tunnel floor. "And what?" Sarah pressed. Ethan knelt, pointing to a faint scuff mark on the ground. "There's evidence of heavy equipment being moved. Something was dragged through here recently." Sarah's stomach tightened. The idea of James being caught up in something beyond a tragic accident felt both terrifying and oddly hopeful. If he was involved with these people, it meant he might still be alive. The dog barked once, its sharp tone bouncing off the walls. It had stopped ahead of them, standing beside a fork in the tunnel. One path was narrow and steep, descending deeper into the earth. The other was wider, with faint markings on the walls that looked like old mining symbols. Ethan crouched by the fork, studying the ground. "Two sets of boot prints here, both recent. One went deeper," he said, gesturing toward the narrow path, "and one went left." The dog sat down and stared at Sarah, its amber eyes fixed on her. It barked again, softly this time, and nudged its nose toward the narrower tunnel. Sarah exchanged a glance with Ethan. "It wants us to go deeper." Ethan sighed. "Of course it does. Why would this be easy?" The air grew colder as they followed the narrow path. The light from their flashlights illuminated strange markings on the walls, symbols etched into the rock, some faded with time, others disturbingly fresh. "What are these?" Sarah asked, running her fingers over one of the newer carvings. Ethan frowned. "Not standard mining symbols, that's for sure. These look deliberate, like someone's trying to mark a specific route." A sudden gust of wind blew through the tunnel, carrying with it a faint metallic scent. Sarah shivered, pulling her jacket tighter. The dog's ears perked, and it barked again, trotting ahead toward an opening in the rock. When Sarah and Ethan reached it, they found themselves standing at the threshold of a vast cavern. Sarah gasped. The cavern stretched beyond the reach of their flashlight beams, its ceiling glittering with what appeared to be massive crystalline formations. The air seemed to hum faintly, a subtle vibration that resonated in her chest. Ethan swept his light across the space, revealing abandoned scientific equipment, tripods, sample bags, and a solar-powered lantern that still emitted a faint glow. "This," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "This is James's work." She rushed to the equipment, her hands trembling as she picked up a weathered notebook lying on the ground. Flipping it open, she immediately recognized James's meticulous handwriting. Day 94. "The crystals emit a low-frequency energy I can't yet explain. Preliminary tests suggest unique piezoelectric properties far beyond anything documented. Potential applications for clean energy are staggering." Day 127. "Someone's following me. I've heard voices in the upper tunnels at night. I don't think I'm alone here anymore." Day 146. "If you find this, Sarah, you were right. I couldn't leave this alone, but neither can they. Be careful." Her throat tightened as she read the last entry. "He knew they were after him," she murmured. Ethan crouched beside her, scanning the notebook. "This isn't just a scientific discovery," he said grimly. "It's a breakthrough. Clean energy from these crystals could disrupt entire industries. Oil, gas, mining. If James stumbled onto something this big, they wouldn't let him walk away." Sarah finished, her voice hollow. The dog growled low, its ears flat against its head. Sarah's flashlight followed its gaze to a dark corner of the cavern, where a pile of rocks partially concealed a newer-looking backpack. Ethan moved cautiously toward it, pulling the bag free. It was heavy, filled with neatly packed gear, rope, climbing carabiners, and what appeared to be a high-powered radio transmitter. "This isn't James's," Ethan said, unzipping a side pocket. He pulled out a laminated card. "Harrison Covert Technologies. These guys aren't scientists. They're contractors. Security or worse." Sarah's heart pounded. "They're still here, aren't they?" Ethan's answer was a sharp nod. And they'll be back soon. As if on cue, the faintest sound reached their ears. Voices, muffled but unmistakable, coming from the tunnel behind them. "Sarah, we need to go," Ethan said, standing quickly and shouldering the pack. "Now." The dog barked sharply, running toward a smaller passage at the far end of the cavern. "Wait," Sarah said, clutching the notebook. "What if James is still here? What if they have him?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "If they do, we can't help him by getting caught. We need to regroup, call for backup." "I'm not leaving him," Sarah snapped, her voice echoing through the cavern. The voices behind them grew louder. Ethan swore under his breath. "Fine, but we follow the dog. It knows these tunnels better than we do." They followed the shepherd into the smaller passage, their flashlights bouncing against the jagged walls as they ran. Behind them, the faint echoes of voices grew sharper, angrier, until they were unmistakably shouts. Sarah's heart pounded as the tunnel twisted and turned, the dog leading them deeper into the labyrinth. Every step felt like a gamble, but she clung to one certainty: James was close. The narrow tunnel seemed to stretch endlessly, the air growing colder with each step. Sarah's flashlight beam danced erratically along the jagged walls as she followed the dog, her breath quick and shallow. Behind her, Ethan moved steadily, his face set in grim determination. The faint shouts of the pursuers echoed behind them, though they were growing more distant. "We're putting some space between us and them," Ethan said, his voice low but steady. "For now." The dog stopped abruptly at a junction, its ears twitching. It sniffed the ground, then turned decisively down the left path. Sarah didn't hesitate, trusting its instincts completely. "This dog," Ethan muttered as they followed. "It's too smart, almost like it knows the layout of these tunnels." Sarah glanced back at him. "You think it's just a coincidence? That it brought me James's jacket, led us to this mine?" Ethan shook his head. "No, I think it's here for a reason, and I think we'd better keep trusting it." The tunnel opened into a smaller chamber, its walls glittering faintly with mineral deposits. Sarah paused to catch her breath, leaning against the cool rock. The dog paced the room, its movements restless, as if sensing the tension in the air. Ethan crouched down, examining the ground with his flashlight. "Footprints again," he said, his brow furrowing. "And drag marks. Looks like someone was pulled through here not too long ago." Sarah's stomach churned. "Do you think it was James?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. He stood, brushing dust from his hands. "It's possible, but we don't know for sure. Whoever it was, they were taken deeper into the mine." Sarah's grip tightened on James's notebook. "Then we keep going." The tunnel descended steeply, the walls closing in as they moved deeper into the mountain. After what felt like an eternity, they emerged into another cavern. This one was larger than the first, its ceiling lost in shadow. The crystals here were enormous, some reaching the size of small trees, their surfaces refracting the light from Sarah and Ethan's flashlights into faint rainbows. But it wasn't the crystals that caught Sarah's attention. It was the camp. Nestled against one wall was a makeshift shelter. A tarp stretched over a steel frame, surrounded by crates and equipment. A small lantern flickered weakly, casting long shadows across the cavern. Sarah's heart leapt. This has to be his. She rushed to the camp, her hands shaking as she rifled through the scattered items. A worn backpack, a half-empty water bottle, a pair of boots that were unmistakably James's size. "He was here," she said, her voice trembling. "Not just once. He was living here." Ethan knelt beside her, examining the equipment. "This is survival gear. He must have been trying to stay hidden." Sarah pulled a faded photograph from the backpack. It was of her and James, taken during one of their hiking trips years ago. Her knees buckled, and she sank to the ground, clutching the photo to her chest. "James," she whispered. The dog padded over, resting its head on her knee as if to comfort her. Ethan stood abruptly, his flashlight sweeping across the cavern. "We're not alone." Sarah froze, her heart pounding. "What do you mean?" "Look," he said, pointing to the far end of the cavern. A shadow moved briefly, disappearing behind one of the larger crystal formations. Sarah scrambled to her feet, clutching James's notebook tightly. The dog growled low in its throat, its ears flat against its head. Ethan pulled a small handgun from his pack, holding it at the ready. "Stay behind me." Before Sarah could respond, a voice echoed from the shadows. "Well, well," it drawled, low and mocking. "Looks like we've got company." Two figures stepped into the light, both dressed in dark tactical gear. The man in front smirked, his eyes scanning Sarah and Ethan with cold amusement. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice calm but laced with menace. "Where's James?" Sarah demanded, stepping forward despite Ethan's warning glare. The man raised an eyebrow. "Ah, the wife! I should have guessed." He tilted his head, studying her. "You're a persistent one, I'll give you that, but this is where your little adventure ends." Ethan raised his gun, his stance steady. "You don't want to do this," he said. The man's smirk widened. "And you don't want to test me. My team will be here any minute. Put the gun down and walk away, old man. Maybe I'll let you both live." The dog barked sharply, its stance defensive. Sarah's mind raced. They were outnumbered and outgunned, but she couldn't let it end here, not when James might still be alive. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice shaking. The man's expression hardened. "What we want is to finish our work without any interference. Your husband had a hard time understanding that. I'd hate for you to make the same mistake." Sarah's grip on the notebook tightened. "James is alive, isn't he?" The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he motioned to the other figure, who stepped forward with a rope in hand. Ethan's gun didn't waver. "You take one more step, and I'll make sure you regret it." The tension in the cavern was suffocating. The dog barked again, louder this time, and lunged at the second figure. Chaos erupted. The man shouted as the dog latched onto his arm, dragging him to the ground. Ethan fired a warning shot, the sound echoing like a thunderclap. "Run!" Ethan yelled, shoving Sarah toward the far side of the cavern. She hesitated, torn between fleeing and staying to fight, but the dog barked urgently, snapping her out of her paralysis. She grabbed the photograph and James's backpack, then sprinted toward a narrow passage on the other side of the cavern. Ethan backed toward her, firing another shot to keep their pursuers at bay. "Go! I'll cover you!" The last thing Sarah saw before ducking into the tunnel was the dog, still holding its ground beside Ethan, its eyes blazing with fierce determination. The tunnel twisted and turned, the walls closing in until Sarah could barely squeeze through. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her legs trembling with exhaustion. Finally, she stumbled into a smaller chamber, collapsing against the wall. The faint sound of rushing water reached her ears, accompanied by the soft hum of the crystals around her. "James?" she whispered, clutching the photograph. "I'm coming." The dog appeared moments later, its coat streaked with dust, but otherwise unharmed. It nudged her shoulder, its eyes urging her to get up. Sarah forced herself to her feet, her resolve hardening. She wasn't giving up. Not now. Not ever. "Let's find him," she said, her voice steady. With the dog leading the way once again, Sarah pressed deeper into the mountain, the distant sound of footsteps behind her a reminder that time was running out. The tunnel seemed to stretch endlessly, winding deeper into the mountain's heart. The air was thick, damp, and heavy, pressing down on Sarah with every step. She kept her flashlight trained ahead, her heart hammering in her chest. Behind her, the sound of footsteps and shouted commands echoed faintly, a grim reminder of the danger she and the dog had narrowly escaped. The dog pressed forward with unwavering determination, occasionally looking back to ensure Sarah was keeping pace. Its presence was a lifeline, grounding her in the midst of panic. The tunnel eventually opened into a smaller cavern. Crystals jutted from the walls, their jagged edges catching the beam of her flashlight and casting fractured rainbows across the space. Sarah paused to catch her breath, leaning against the cool rock. The dog barked softly, nudging her leg with its nose. "I know," she whispered. "We can't stop." She adjusted the straps of James's backpack, its weight both comforting and burdensome. Every step forward felt like walking into the unknown, but she clung to the hope that James was waiting somewhere ahead. The dog led her to another narrow passage, the sound of rushing water growing louder with each step. The air grew cooler and carried a metallic tang that reminded Sarah of iron. When the tunnel finally opened again, she found herself standing at the edge of an underground river. The water was black and fast-moving, churning as it disappeared into the darkness. A narrow ledge hugged the wall, barely wide enough to walk on. Sarah shone her flashlight across the chamber, her beam catching something on the far side, a tent. Her breath caught. The tent was newer than the makeshift camp she'd found earlier. Its fabric was taut, anchored with modern climbing gear. A faint glow came from within, suggesting someone had been there recently. The dog barked sharply, its tail wagging as it bounded toward the edge of the river. Sarah's gaze darted to the ledge. It was precarious, slick with condensation, and offered little in the way of handholds. The thought of crossing it made her stomach churn, but the sight of the tent filled her with a desperate urgency. "I'm not stopping now," she said aloud, more to herself than to the dog. She stepped onto the ledge, her boots slipping slightly on the wet surface. The dog followed behind her, its movements cautious but steady. The roar of the river drowned out her thoughts, leaving only the pounding of her heart and the sound of her breathing. Inch by inch, she made her way across, her flashlight clamped tightly in one hand as she used the other to steady herself against the wall. When she finally reached the other side, her legs were shaking and her palms were scraped raw from gripping the jagged rock. The dog leapt nimbly onto the bank, shaking out its coat before trotting toward the tent. Sarah followed, her flashlight sweeping over the area. She crouched at the entrance of the tent, her fingers trembling as she pulled back the flap. Inside, she found a neatly arranged assortment of supplies: a lantern, a portable stove, and several notebooks stacked on top of each other. Her gaze locked onto the notebooks, her heart leaping as she recognized James's handwriting. She grabbed the top one, flipping it open to find detailed sketches of crystal formations and energy readings. On one of the pages, James had written, "They're coming for the crystals. Must protect the discovery. The energy levels are increasing. Sarah, if you find this, I'm sorry. I love you. Don't stop." Her hands trembled as she clutched the notebook. "James?" The dog barked sharply, snapping her attention back to the present. Its ears were pinned back, its body tense as it stared toward the passage she had just crossed. Sarah froze, straining to listen. Footsteps. The pursuers had found the river. The first figure appeared on the ledge, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. He spotted Sarah almost immediately, shouting to someone behind him, "Over here! She's got the notes!" Panic surged through her veins. She grabbed as many notebooks as she could fit into James's backpack, her fingers fumbling in her haste. The dog growled, stepping protectively in front of her as two more figures emerged, their flashlights glaring like searchlights. "Enough running," one of them called. "Hand over the bag, and this ends now." Sarah's voice shook with defiance. "Where's James? What did you do to him?" The leader stepped forward, his expression cold and calculating. "You really want to know? Fine, he's deeper in the caves, exactly where he belongs. But if you don't cooperate, you'll never see him again." Her grip on the backpack tightened. "You're lying," the man smirked. "Maybe I am. Maybe I'm not. Either way, you don't have a choice." The dog barked furiously, its stance low and defensive. The man reached for a weapon holstered at his side, but before he could draw it, the dog lunged, teeth sinking into his arm. He yelled in pain, staggering backward. Sarah didn't hesitate. She grabbed the nearest lantern from the tent and hurled it at the second figure, the glass shattering on impact and spilling oil across the ground. "Run!" she shouted to the dog, her voice echoing off the cavern walls. The dog released its grip and bolted toward the nearest tunnel, Sarah close on its heels. Shouts and curses rang out behind her as the pursuers scrambled to regroup. The new tunnel was narrow and uneven, forcing Sarah to move carefully despite her panic. The dog led the way, its instincts guiding it through the labyrinthine passages. After what felt like an eternity, the tunnel opened into another chamber, this one smaller and less polished than the others. A single light shone faintly from a corner, and Sarah's heart soared when she saw what it illuminated. A man sat slumped against the wall, his clothes tattered and his face pale, but his eyes... "James," Sarah breathed. He looked up slowly, his expression one of disbelief. "Sarah?" She dropped to her knees beside him, tears streaming down her face as she touched his arm. "It's me. I found you." James's voice was hoarse, barely more than a whisper. "You shouldn't have come. It's not safe." "I couldn't stop," she said, clutching his hand. "Not until I knew the truth." The dog pressed close, its tail wagging furiously as it licked James's face. James managed a weak smile. "Good boy," he murmured, his voice cracking. Their reunion was short-lived. The sound of footsteps echoed through the chamber, louder and closer than before. "They're coming," Sarah said, her panic returning. James's expression hardened. We can't let them take the crystals. If they figure out how to weaponize the energy, he shook his head. We have to stop them. Sarah stared at him, torn between the overwhelming relief of finding him and the fear of losing him again. How? She asked. James gestured weakly to a device on the ground, a compact but intricate piece of equipment. I've been working on something. It'll destroy the unstable crystals and collapse the tunnels, but we need to get out first. Sarah hesitated for only a moment before nodding. Then let's end this. The hum of the crystals vibrated faintly in Sarah's chest as she crouched beside James, examining the device he had pointed out. It was smaller than she'd expected. An improvised detonator cobbled together from spare parts and powered by one of the strange crystalline formations. Are you sure this will work? She asked, glancing nervously at the tunnel where their pursuers' footsteps echoed closer. James nodded weakly, his voice hoarse. It's designed to target the unstable crystals in the primary cavern. Once they're destroyed, the chain reaction will collapse the surrounding tunnels. Ethan's voice crackled faintly through Sarah's memory. Sometimes the truth isn't what we hope for. She swallowed hard. What about you? Can you move? James struggled to sit upright, his face pale but resolute. With help. The dog nudged his side, its tail wagging slightly, as if offering encouragement. Sarah turned to the glowing device in her hands. How do I activate it? James's gaze met hers, his expression grim. You don't. I do. It has to be armed manually at the cavern's core. Her heart sank. No, you can't. I have to, James interrupted, his tone firm despite his weakened state. This is my mess, Sarah. I've been fighting to protect this discovery for years, and I'm not letting them turn it into a weapon. But you can help me by getting out alive. His hand closed over hers, steadying her trembling fingers. Please, Sarah. The footsteps grew louder, accompanied by harsh voices barking orders. Time was running out. Sarah clenched her jaw, forcing down the rising tide of fear and grief. All right, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But we're getting you to the cavern first. With the dog acting as a vigilant guide, Sarah hauled James to his feet, draping his arm over her shoulders to support his weight. Every step was a struggle, the weight of the backpack digging into her shoulders and James's labored breathing heavy in her ears. The dog led them through another twisting passage, its ears swiveling constantly as it listened for danger. Stay close, Sarah urged, her flashlight beam sweeping the rocky walls. The crystals glimmered faintly in response, their ethereal glow casting dancing reflections across the tunnel. They emerged into the primary cavern, the vast, glittering expanse where James had made his camp. The crystals here were larger and denser, their humming vibrations stronger than ever. James gestured weakly to a raised platform of rock near the center. There. That's where the device needs to go. Sarah hesitated, her gaze flicking between James and the tunnel behind them. We don't have much time. Those men are. Her words were cut off by the sharp crack of a gunshot. The sound echoed through the cavern, followed by a harsh voice. Nobody move. Sarah froze, her flashlight trembling in her hand as three figures stepped into the cavern. The leader, the man who had spoken to her earlier, aimed his weapon squarely at them. You've led us on quite the chase, he sneered. His gaze shifted to James, and a cold smile spread across his face. Dr. Dawson, I was starting to think you didn't want to see me. James straightened as much as his weakened body would allow. Whatever you think you're going to accomplish here, it won't work. Oh, I think it will, the man replied, stepping closer. You've done all the hard work for us. These crystals, this energy, will be revolutionary. You don't understand what you're dealing with, James said, his voice gaining strength. The crystals are unstable. Because if you try to extract them without proper containment, you'll trigger a chain reaction. The man smirked. Is that supposed to scare me? It should, Sarah interjected, stepping in front of James. Her heart pounded, but her voice was steady. If you take these crystals, you'll destroy everything, this cavern, the mountain, and yourselves included. The man's expression darkened. You think I'm bluffing? Hand over the backpack, now. The dog growled low, its stance protective, as it placed itself between Sarah and the intruders. Before the leader could move, the dog lunged, its jaws closing around his arm with ferocious strength. He cried out, firing a wild shot that ricocheted harmlessly off the cavern wall. Run! James shouted, shoving Sarah toward the platform with the device. She hesitated for only a moment before sprinting to the raised rock. Her fingers fumbled as she placed the device, activating the timer James had described. "We've got to get out of here," she yelled, her voice echoing through the cavern. James was already moving, his determination pushing him beyond his limits. The dog released its grip on the leader and darted back to Sarah's side, barking sharply as if urging them onward. The timer on the device began to count down. The group raced for the nearest tunnel, the ground trembling beneath their feet as the device began its work. The hum of the crystals grew louder, their glow intensifying until the entire cavern was bathed in an otherworldly light. Behind them, the leader shouted orders to his men, but it was too late. The first explosion sent a deafening crack through the air, followed by the sound of collapsing rock. Sarah clung to James as they stumbled through the tunnel, the dog leading the way with unwavering focus. Dust and debris rained down around them, the walls shaking with each successive blast. "Faster!" Sarah urged, her lungs burning as she struggled to keep moving. The light from her flashlight flickered, threatening to go out. The tunnel seemed to stretch endlessly, every step a battle against exhaustion and fear. Finally, a faint glimmer of daylight appeared ahead. The dog barked, its pace quickening as it led them toward the surface. They burst from the tunnel just as the final explosion rocked the mountain. Sarah turned, shielding her eyes as a cloud of dust and rock erupted from the entrance. The ground beneath her feet was still, the chaos finally subsiding. She sank to her knees, gasping for breath. James collapsed beside her, his face pale but alive. The dog sat at their side, its tail wagging faintly as it leaned against Sarah. "We did it," James murmured, his voice barely audible. Sarah wrapped her arms around him, tears streaming down her face. "You're safe. That's all that matters." In the distance, the faint sound of sirens reached their ears. Ethan and the rescue team were on their way. The sirens grew louder as Sarah knelt beside James, brushing dust from his face. His eyes fluttered open briefly, a faint smile crossing his lips before exhaustion pulled him under again. The dog whined softly, nosing at James's side as if urging him to stay awake. Sarah placed a trembling hand on its head, drawing strength from its steady presence. A few minutes later, a convoy of vehicles pulled into view beyond the clearing. Ethan was the first to step out, his face a mixture of relief and determination as he rushed toward them. Behind him, rescue personnel and uniformed agents spilled out of the vehicles, moving with military precision. "Sarah?" Ethan called, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Over here!" she shouted back, her voice hoarse. Ethan reached them in seconds, his sharp eyes scanning James before turning to Sarah. "He's alive?" "Barely," Sarah said, brushing tears from her face. "We need to get him to a hospital." Ethan nodded, signaling to the paramedics. As they moved in to tend to James, Ethan crouched beside Sarah, lowering his voice. "What happened down there?" Sarah glanced back at the collapsed tunnel, its entrance now buried beneath a mountain of rubble. "James destroyed the crystals," she said. "He said they were too dangerous, too unstable. If they fell into the wrong hands." She shook her head, with her voice faltering. Ethan placed a steady hand on her shoulder. "You did the right thing, both of you." While the medics worked on James, the sound of heavy boots on gravel drew Sarah's attention. She turned to see the leader of the mercenary group being dragged out of the woods, his hands cuffed behind his back. His face was smeared with dirt, and his expression was twisted with rage. Two agents flanked him, their grips firm as they hauled him toward a waiting vehicle. "This isn't over," he snarled, his voice venomous. "You think you've won, but you haven't. People like me don't just disappear." Sarah stood, her fists clenched at her sides. "No," she said, her voice cold and steady. "But the truth won't disappear either. What you've done, what you've tried to do, it'll all come out." The man sneered, but his bravado faltered under her unwavering gaze. The agents shoved him into the back of the vehicle, slamming the door shut behind him. Ethan stepped beside her. "That's one down. The rest of his team won't be far behind." "They're not the only ones responsible," Sarah said. "Someone sent them. Someone funded all of this." Ethan's jaw tightened. "We'll find them, I promise." As the dust settled, the paramedics loaded James into an ambulance, his vitals stabilized, but his condition still fragile. Sarah climbed in beside him, refusing to let go of his hand. The dog sat at her feet, its head resting on her knee as the vehicle rumbled to life. Ethan stood outside, watching as the ambulance pulled away. His expression was unreadable, but there was a faint glimmer of satisfaction in his eyes. It was nearly dawn when they reached the hospital. The paramedics wheeled James inside, where a team of doctors and nurses took over. Sarah stayed in the waiting room, the dog curled up beside her, its steady breathing the only thing keeping her grounded. Hours passed in a blur. Nurses came and went, offering updates on James's condition, stable but critical. Finally, as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the hospital windows, a doctor approached her. "He's awake," the doctor said gently. "You can see him now." Relief flooded through Sarah as she followed the doctor down the hallway. The dog padded silently at her side, its tail wagging faintly. James was propped up in bed, his face pale, but his eyes bright with recognition. When he saw her, his smile was immediate, though it was tinged with exhaustion. "Hey," he said, his voice rasping. "Hey yourself," Sarah replied, tears blurring her vision as she took his hand. The dog rested its head on the edge of the bed, earning a weak chuckle from James. "Still looking out for us, huh?" "Always," Sarah said, her voice breaking. In the days that followed, Sarah and James worked with Ethan and the federal agents to piece together the full scope of what had happened. James's research notes, combined with the data retrieved from the mercenaries' equipment, painted a chilling picture. The crystals were far more powerful than anyone had realized, capable of revolutionizing energy storage and production, but also of causing catastrophic destruction if misused. The organization behind the mercenaries was a shadowy conglomerate with ties to energy monopolies and private military contractors. Their goal had been simple: control the crystals to maintain their stranglehold on global energy markets. They didn't care about the science, James said during one of his debriefings. They just saw dollar signs, and if that meant killing me to get what they wanted, so be it. The agents assured them that the organization's leaders would be brought to justice, but Sarah remained skeptical. "People like that don't stop," she told Ethan. "Not unless you stop them for good." "We will," Ethan promised, "but it's going to take time." As the investigation continued, James faced a difficult choice: keep his discovery secret or share it with the scientific community. "They'll come after us again if we publish this," Sarah said one evening as they sat together in their small hospital room. The dog lay curled up at their feet, its ears twitching in its sleep. James nodded. "I know, but keeping it hidden isn't the answer either. This could change the world, Sarah, for the better." She took his hand, her expression pained but resolute. "Then we'll face whatever comes, together." A week later, James was discharged from the hospital. The media frenzy had died down, but the ripples of their discovery were only just beginning to spread. Back at their cabin, life slowly returned to a new kind of normal. The dog, officially named Ranger, became a permanent part of their family, a living reminder of the loyalty and courage that had brought them through the darkest of days. James began documenting his findings in earnest, collaborating with scientists who shared his vision for a sustainable future. Meanwhile, Sarah returned to her roots as a journalist, determined to expose the hidden networks that had nearly destroyed them. One evening, as the sun dipped below the Rockies, Sarah and James sat together on the porch, their hands entwined. Ranger lay at their feet, watching the horizon with quiet vigilance. "Do you think it's over?" Sarah asked softly. James squeezed her hand. "Maybe not, but we're ready for whatever comes next." Sarah leaned her head against his shoulder, and her heart full despite the uncertainties ahead. They had faced the mountain's secrets and each other's fears, and come out stronger on the other side. In the distance, the first stars began to appear, their light steady and enduring. The morning was calm, the crisp air carrying the scent of pine and damp earth as Sarah stepped out onto the porch. The Rockies stood tall in the distance, their peaks gilded by the first light of dawn. Ranger sat at her feet, his ears twitching at the occasional rustle of the trees. Inside the cabin, James was seated at the kitchen table, his notes and sketches spread out before him. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind of recovery and reflection, but now the focus had shifted. His work, the discovery of the crystals and their immense potential, had taken on a new urgency. Sarah watched him through the window, his brow furrowed in concentration. The scars of his time in the mountain were still visible. His thinner frame, the lines of exhaustion etched into his face. But his resolve was stronger than ever. She stepped back inside, setting a mug of coffee in front of him. "Thanks," James said, offering her a tired smile. "How's it coming?" she asked, nodding toward the scattered papers. "Slowly," he admitted. "There's so much to document, and I keep second-guessing myself. Every detail has to be perfect. If this goes public..." He trailed off, his expression troubled. Sarah sat across from him, her hands wrapped around her own mug. "You're doing the right thing, James. The world needs to know." "I just wish I could guarantee it'll be used the right way," he said, "that it won't end up in the wrong hands again." "Nothing's guaranteed," Sarah said softly, "but we've seen what happens when the truth is buried. At least this way, we're giving people a chance." The day passed uneventfully until late afternoon, when Ethan's truck rumbled into the driveway. Sarah met him on the porch, her expression immediately alert at the grim set of his jaw. "What is it?" she asked. Ethan climbed out, holding a thick folder under one arm. "We've got a problem." Inside the cabin, Ethan spread the contents of the folder across the table. Newspaper clippings, surveillance photos, and handwritten notes formed a web of connections that made Sarah's stomach churn. "The organization we took down at the mine," Ethan began, "was just one arm of something much bigger. These people have ties to multinational corporations, private military firms, even government officials, and they know about James's work." James leaned forward, his eyes scanning the documents. "How much do they know?" "Enough to be dangerous," Ethan said. "They've already started moving resources into the area. Whatever they're planning, it's big." Sarah's mind raced. "You're saying they're coming after us again?" Ethan nodded. "They see you as a threat, both of you. If they can't control the crystals, they'll do everything they can to make sure no one else can either." The room was heavy with silence as Sarah and James processed the implications. Ranger, sensing the tension, rested his head on Sarah's lap, his steady presence grounding her. "We can't just sit here and wait for them to come to us," Sarah said finally. "We need to act." James looked at her, his jaw set. "You mean going public now?" "Yes," she said. "The longer we wait, the more time they have to cover their tracks. If we release everything, your research, the data from the mine, it'll put them under the spotlight. They can't operate in the shadows if the world is watching." Ethan frowned. "That's a risky move. Once this is out there, you won't be able to take it back. They'll come after you harder than ever." "I know," Sarah said, meeting his gaze. "But they'll come after us anyway. At least this way, we'll have the truth on our side." James took a deep breath, his hand brushing over the notebooks spread across the table. "All right," he said. "Let's do it." The next 48 hours were a blur of preparation. James compiled his research into a cohesive report, detailing the properties of the crystals and their potential applications. Sarah reached out to trusted contacts in journalism and academia, ensuring the information would reach the right people. On the third day, the story broke. Major news outlets picked up the report, broadcasting headlines about the discovery of a revolutionary energy source hidden deep in the Rockies. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Scientists around the world hailed the findings as groundbreaking, while energy corporations scrambled to downplay the implications. Social media buzzed with speculation and debate, turning the crystals into a global phenomenon overnight. But amidst the chaos, there was an undercurrent of danger. It began with anonymous threats, cryptic emails and voicemails warning Sarah and James to stay silent. Then came the surveillance. Sarah noticed unfamiliar cars parked down the road from their cabin, and Ranger's growls became more frequent at night. Ethan increased his visits, his presence a constant reassurance. But even he couldn't shake the growing sense of unease. "They're testing you," he said one evening as they sat on the porch. "Trying to see how far they can push before you push back." Sarah's jaw tightened. "They can push all they want. We're not backing down." The tension came to a head one night when Sarah woke to the sound of Ranger barking furiously. She bolted out of bed, grabbing a flashlight as James stirred beside her. "What is it?" he mumbled, still half asleep. "Ranger's outside," she said, already heading for the door. She found the dog standing at the edge of the yard, his body rigid as he stared into the darkness. Sarah followed his gaze, her flashlight revealing a figure retreating into the trees. "Stay here?" Ethan said from behind her, his own flashlight and handgun at the ready. He disappeared into the woods, Ranger close at his heels. Minutes felt like hours as Sarah and James waited. When Ethan returned, his face was grim. "They were planting something by the cabin," he said, holding up a small device. Sarah's blood ran cold. "A listening device?" Ethan nodded. "And probably not the only one." The discovery of the surveillance devices only strengthened Sarah and James's resolve. They worked tirelessly to expand their network of allies, enlisting scientists, journalists, and activists who believed in the importance of their discovery. The organization's attempts to intimidate them grew bolder, but so did the public support. Protests erupted outside corporate headquarters, demanding accountability and transparency. Independent researchers began replicating James's findings, ensuring the knowledge couldn't be silenced. Through it all, Ranger remained a constant presence, his loyalty unwavering. Weeks turned into months as the battle played out on multiple fronts: legal, scientific, and personal. The organization's influence began to crumble under the weight of scrutiny, their secrets dragged into the light. For Sarah and James, the journey was far from over, but they had won the first and most important battle, ensuring the truth couldn't be buried again. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, James turned to Sarah with a faint smile. "We made it this far," he said. "That has to count for something." She took his hand, her gaze drifting to the mountains in the distance. "It counts for everything." Ranger barked softly, his tail wagging as if in agreement. The air carried a crisp chill as Sarah stepped out onto the porch, the first rays of sunlight spilling over the Rockies. She clutched a warm mug of coffee in her hands, savoring the stillness. It had been 6 months since they had gone public with James's discovery, and life had begun to settle into a new rhythm. Behind her, the door creaked open, and James stepped out, leaning lightly on a cane. He had regained much of his strength, though the scars of his time in the cave still lingered in subtle ways. A wince when he moved too quickly, the occasional far-off look in his eyes. "Couldn't sleep either?" Sarah asked, offering him a smile. "Too much on my mind," he replied, lowering himself into the chair beside her. Ranger padded out after him, settling at their feet with a contented sigh. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the warmth of the coffee and the rising sun wrapping around them like a blanket. "So," James said finally, his voice breaking the quiet, "what's the latest from Ethan?" Sarah exhaled, setting her mug down. "He called last night. They've officially tied the mercenaries to 3 major energy conglomerates. The investigation's expanding. Government contracts, offshore accounts, the works. It's going to take years to untangle it all, but at least the wheels are turning." James nodded, a flicker of satisfaction crossing his face. "And the crystals?" "They've started regulated studies," Sarah said. "Your colleagues at the university are overseeing everything. It's going to be slow, but it's safe. No one's getting near them without proper protocols." "Good." James leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes briefly. "It's strange, isn't it? How something so small can change everything." Sarah reached over, taking his hand. "It wasn't just the crystals. It was you, James. What you discovered, what you risked, it's bigger than either of us." He gave her hand a gentle squeeze. "I couldn't have done it without you." Over the next few weeks, the cabin became a hub of quiet but determined activity. James's work on the crystals had sparked a global conversation about sustainable energy, and researchers from around the world sought his insight. Video calls and emails poured in, filling the small space with the buzz of collaboration. Sarah returned to her journalism roots, focusing on investigative pieces that exposed the shadowy networks behind the mercenary groups. Her articles gained traction, sparking public outcry and pushing for policy changes to regulate corporate influence over scientific discoveries. Ethan remained a steady presence, visiting regularly to update them on the investigation and provide a layer of protection they didn't always realize they needed. "We've come a long way," Ethan said one evening, sitting at the kitchen table with them. "But there's still a long road ahead." Sarah nodded. "At least we're not walking it alone." The first anniversary of their discovery came quietly, marked not by fanfare, but by reflection. Sarah and James decided to hike one of the smaller trails near their cabin, retracing the steps that had brought them to this point. The path wound through dense evergreens, opening occasionally to reveal breathtaking views of the valley below. Ranger bounded ahead, his tail wagging, as he paused to sniff at every interesting scent. "This feels familiar," James said with a wry smile as they stopped to catch their breath. Sarah laughed, hopefully less life-threatening this time. They reached a clearing as the sun dipped low in the sky, painting the landscape in shades of gold and amber. James lowered himself onto a flat rock, his gaze distant as he took it all in. "I spent so many years in the dark," he said softly, both literally and figuratively. "I wasn't sure I'd ever see this again." Sarah sat beside him, leaning her head on his shoulder. "You never stopped fighting, James. Even when it felt impossible, you kept going. That's what brought you back. And you," he added, his voice thick with emotion, "you never gave up on me." Ranger barked, breaking the moment with his cheerful energy. He nudged James's arm, then dropped something at his feet, a weathered stick. James laughed, picking it up and tossing it into the trees. "All right, boy, let's see what you've got." As the days turned into weeks, the momentum of their work continued to grow. James's discovery became a beacon of hope for a world desperate for sustainable solutions. His research was published in peer-reviewed journals, and international collaborations began to form, all focused on unlocking the crystal's potential. Sarah's articles gained recognition, earning her awards and invitations to speak at conferences. But for her, the true reward was knowing that their fight had made a difference. Ethan, ever the pragmatist, remained watchful. "You've shaken a hornet's nest," he reminded them during one of his visits. "The world may be watching, but that doesn't mean everyone's happy about it." "We know," Sarah said, "but we're ready." One evening, as Sarah and James sat by the fireplace, Ranger curled up at their feet, Sarah found herself reflecting on everything they'd endured. The mountain had taken so much from them, years of their lives, a sense of safety, but it had also given them something in return. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if that dog hadn't shown up?" she asked, her voice thoughtful. James smiled, reaching down to scratch Ranger's ears. "I think he knew we needed him as much as he needed us." Sarah nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude. "He brought us back together. He brought us home." James leaned over, kissing her forehead. "And now it's up to us to make sure the world knows what we found." Ranger stirred, lifting his head to look at them with his intelligent, knowing eyes. It was as if he understood every word. Outside, the stars began to appear, their light steady and enduring. The mountain loomed in the distance, its secrets no longer a source of fear, but a reminder of what they had overcome. A year later, the world looked different. The first prototypes of crystal-based energy systems were unveiled, sparking a new era of innovation. James's name became synonymous with scientific progress, though he remained humble, often redirecting praise to his team and collaborators. Sarah's journalism continued to shine a light on the darker corners of power, her voice a rallying cry for transparency and accountability. And Ranger? He remained the heart of their little family, his loyalty unwavering. Whether chasing sticks, patrolling the cabin's perimeter, or simply lying at their feet, he was a constant reminder of the bond that had carried them through. As they stood together one evening, watching the sunset paint the mountains in hues of gold and purple, Sarah spoke softly. "We've come so far," she said. James wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "And we're just getting started." Ranger barked, his tail wagging as he bounded ahead, leading them down the familiar path toward their home. A trail no longer shrouded in mystery but filled with hope.